Okay, well, with no further ado, I am absolutely honored to welcome Dr. Angela Kross, who is from Concordia University in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment. She is looking at using a technology I know very little about in order to determine how plants have, how vegetation has changed with climate change. Um, her her education is phenomenal and vast. She has got an engineering degree. She has been in Brazil working. She's had a PhD from McGill. She's now at Concordia. I think we are very lucky to have her here and very happy that she said yes to speaking for Women of Science 2020. Please welcome, and if you'd like to put your cameras on, please welcome Dr. Angela Kross.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Yeah. So my name is Angela Cross, and I'm actually very like honored as well to have gotten this invitation. I think it's important for us to share our research and to show what women in science are doing. And this is a great opportunity. I don't think I have been doing enough. So I'm really very pleased. I'm very happy with this invitation. So thank you once again for that, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. um, so I will talk about plant phenology and global climate change, and the approach that I use in my research uses remote sensing. Um, I really like to show this picture here actually because it kind of gives a very brief summary of one part of what I do in my research. So on the background here, this image with red and blue, that is a satellite image, which shows it uses a false color composite. So in a true image, like an image that you use with a camera, you would see vegetation, for example, as green and water as blue, and urban areas maybe grayish. But in this kind of image where we use assign different colors, vegetation appears as red. So healthy vegetation appears as red. The urban area here appears as blue, cyan, and water appears as black. And so that is the input that I use. And then using different methods, models, algorithms, we can then extract information from the image. So you can actually classify the different objects in your image. So this ellipse here shows you an overlay of the satellite image under it, but now it has classes. So where green actually is vegetation and red is urban area and blue is water. Um, and then from this level here, then we go to the next step, which is actually getting information from the satellite image that is really related to plant biophysiological processes. So it goes in three steps, but it involves all kinds of models to go from one to another. But it kind of explains like very rapidly what I do. So um, remote sensing is really about it's the science that allows us to obtain information about objects without touching them. So in the simplest way, it would be looking at something, your eyes, a camera, and then satellite images. And oh yes, before I continue, just to say that if you have any questions in between, then it would be okay, I guess, to to take them. um, so in remote sensing, we use different methods that allow us to obtain information about objects without touching them. So your eyes, a camera, a satellite image. And in this here, I in the study, because my study object is vegetation, I will show you, how you can use the remote sensing approach to look at vegetation dynamics, especially related to climate change. Um, so an overview of what I will talk about. So I will introduce first plant phenology and then remote sensing of plant phenology. And then I have two case studies that will show you that application, and then the conclusions. So plant phenology is defined as the study of recurring plant life cycle. So you can think about this in animal life. It's if you can think about this as like an easy example would be migratory birds, butterflies, the monarch butterflies. Like they travel to the south when it gets cold, and then they come back to the north when it gets warm again, right? So these are recurring events. It happens every year. So with animals, it's actually easy. We can think about it very easily like that. But plants also have phenology, and it's basically when you think, especially in the northern hemisphere, where you have the northern vegetation that lives in very strong seasonal periods. You have the leaf unfolding, flowering periods, leaf fall. The fall when you have the coloring of the leaves. Those are all plant phenological events. And it's actually a very ancient science. Um, but if you look at its timeline here, so it started really like thousands of years ago. Um, and so basically, and the literature divides it in three blocks. So the first block would be when individuals, most of the time farmers, would look at their plants and observe um, these recurring events to help them decide on agriculture practices. So they would look at a plant and say, okay, this plant is flowering, so maybe we can harvest next week or something like that. It was applied really for by individuals. And then in the second block here, basically, that is where it became more of um, a formal science. So where people actually noticed that phenology was actually like these recurring life events were actually very important for the environment, for agriculture, but also for natural ecosystems. And so people started to study more actively why these events were happening, um, and why they were changing. And then the last block is what is happening since the 90s, is when most of, sorry. um, so when most of these studies then showed that um, phenology, so these recurring life events, there was a very strong relationship with climate, and that phenology could actually be used as an indicator of climate change. So then we have a whole new era where phenology really came up as an indicator of climate change, being studied for its relationships with increasing temperatures, precipitation, etc. And then this is where we actually go into the more advanced technology being applied to studying phenology. In the second block, people were still studying this very observational, so going these networks that started in this era here. Those were mainly people that would observe plants and look at the leaf unfolding and flowering and mark the dates. And then in this new era here is where we really are using images, so satellite images, cameras, but also still observational information, because that is always validation, our final validation. So then I have a little video to maybe show you phenology, an example of phenology from the USA National Phenology Network that calls phenology the pulse of our planet. And if you think about this, in the northern hemisphere especially, vegetation starts to grow when it gets warmer, right? So let's say in April, May, when it starts to get warmer, vegetation will start to grow, and it will grow until October, November, when it gets cold again. And that period there, that is when vegetation can actually actively do photosynthesis. So absorb this, convert the sunlight into um, biomass, into chemical energy. So solar energy converting it into chemical energy. And if you think about that, then it makes it maybe easier to understand that depending on that, so if that changes, is that if that period changes that plants are actually being active, then it will affect the overall carbon balance, right? Because plants will absorb CO2 in photosynthesis. And if that period changes, it will affect the carbon uptake overall. So just to show you this short video, or it's an animation. And so what I want you to look at is the green. These are all based on satellite information. So green would be the vegetation greening up, and yellow would be the CO2 that is in the atmosphere. And we're starting at, okay, let me see what we started. Okay, August. So we started in the summer of 2020 here. In August, when it's the peak of the growing season. So you see there is all this vegetation here. It is absorbing the CO2 um, in the atmosphere. And then we go, so October, November, December, the winter. You see the CO2 is all coming out. It's just all our use, right? Our human production. It accumulates in the atmosphere all the way up February in the winter, continues here in March, all CO2. Continues, and then the vegetation starts to come up in May. And then we will see what the vegetation will do, right? It will start to absorb this and clean it up. So the northern hemisphere is a bit more complicated. We have continuous vegetation cover, so you don't see the same pattern as happens in the north. So it's like a breathing process, right? The earth is breathing, and the vegetation is kind of absorbing our CO2 and releasing oxygen into, yes. And so then we have the cycle going over and over again. So this is basically to show you how plant phenology relates to carbon in general. These are all models, mind you, so it's based on satellite data representing the Earth, vegetation, and the CO2. So plant phenology, when you think about it, so you have the start of the season, leaf budding, flowering, leaf fall. We can look at natural vegetation. So here is an example of digital photography. So you have a certain sites where people set up cameras in the field that take daily images, and then you can basically study phenology over time constantly. So you have the winter, the spring, the summer, early autumn, and then late autumn. And then you can also study phenology at the agriculture level, where it is a bit more manipulated, I would say, right? Because agriculture is, plants are harvested. So while this here is natural, this here is actually human intervention. So you plant your sugar beets, for example, and then it's harvested, and then May to October you have a free time. Then it starts, the planting starts, etc. So now what farmers have done in the past by looking at their plants and understanding, what how a plant will react. That kind of knowledge is what people now try to use in agriculture. So how do you predict, for example, disease management, crop disease management based on the different phases? Okay, so that is a bit about the phenology part, and now a bit about the remote sensing of phenology part. And I will give a bit of a sorry, a bit of a background information on this. Um, so when you think about remote sensing, as I mentioned, um, we will kind of go back to two things in this study. So one would be thinking about electromagnetic radiation, or light, so that the sun gives us light energy. Um, the energy travels. Okay, let me just. Okay, sorry, let me just move this a bit. So the energy travels from the sun to the earth, and when it hits an object, um, So this is probably something you would see in your um, science classes, I think. Um, so when the sun hits an object, the object will react in different ways. So it will it can absorb one portion of the light, it can transmit one portion, or it can reflect one portion of the light. So the light that is being reflected is what you actually capture in an image. So your camera or eyes, we see vegetation as green because green light is being reflected. All the visible colors are being absorbed, so we see vegetation as green. We don't see what happens with the invisible, right? The light that is not visible to us. We cannot see that. But satellite images can see that. So we can map near infrared, for example, with satellite images. Um, so based on that interaction, the absorption, the reflectance, and the transmittance, every object on Earth will react differently depending on its chemical structure, on its physical structure, biochemical composition. Every object will interact differently. So plants as a whole group will interact in a certain way, and that is based on the leaf structure. So this is like a profile cut, a cross section of a leaf. This would be an actual one, and this is just a schematic one. So you have the two main layers here, the palisade layer, where you have these cells that have chloroplasts. And then we get back to photosynthesis that you may remember. Um, so photosynthesis, remember, is a process where plants actually convert solar energy into um, biochemical energy, right? So the light is being fixed here. In the process, you use CO2 and water plus solar energy, and then you get biomass. That happens at this level. And here, where you have what is called the spongy mesophyll, there you have other types of cells that will interact in a different way. So in this first level here, where you have chlorophyll, which is responsible for photosynthesis, there will be an interaction there with light. So if you look at this figure here, on the x-axis, it shows you the different wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. So you go from blue, green, red, near infrared. And what I want you to maybe look at is, um, so this portion here, this is the visible light portion here, right? So this whole portion is visible light. So the chlorophyll is responsible for absorbing most of this light. So on the y-axis, you have the light that is being reflected. So remember, light interacts with a leaf. It hits a leaf. It can either be reflected if the leaf is here, absorbed, or it can be transmitted. Um, Whatever is reflected here, this is your graph. So this graph shows you most of the near infrared light here, about 80% is being reflected by the structure of the leaves. But then this portion here shows you that a lot of the light here is being absorbed, and it is being absorbed for the process of photosynthesis. So depending on how healthy the plant is, these the curves here, those are called spectral signatures. They tell us something about the condition of the plant. Like a healthy plant here, green, that is this how the green curve here. It shows us that when a plant is healthy, this is a typical curve. It will show a peak in the green. So we see plants as green, this higher peak. And it absorbs blue and red light. And especially this portion of red light here is being absorbed for photosynthesis. And if I just, so you see that a healthy plant will absorb much more chlorophyll than, for example, this dying plant here. The yellow would be the yellow curve here, right? This one. So here, a lot of the light is being reflected. This entire portion here is not being absorbed by the plant. So this spectral signature here, it gives us information about the health status, the biochemical structure, the composition of vegetation. Here, the near infrared, we don't see it with our eyes, but satellite images can capture this reflectance and you can create maps. It shows us that a plant that is almost dying, so the brown leaf here, um, not a lot of the light is being reflected. So it means that it's very fragile. You don't have a lot of structure to reflect the near infrared light here. So that's why you have this brown lower reflectance. So that is the basis of what we use for, in remote sensing, and the satellite images. All this information is present there. And then, so this is the spongy mesophyll. So chlorophyll is responsible for absorbing the visible light, and then the structure of your this portion here is responsible for reflectance of near infrared light. And then we have the spongy mesophyll also. This is where you will have water in your leaf, and water will also interact with light. It will absorb the what is called the middle infrared light. So at this portion here. So if you think about the electromagnetic radiation, these are all your wavelengths. This is your visible light. This is your near infrared light, this portion here, and here you have your middle infrared light, shortwave infrared light, and this is where water will interact. So you see that if a leaf is very stressed, which is this one here up, it will not absorb a lot of the middle infrared light. So you will be able, like if you get this spectral signature from a satellite image, you will be able to tell whether the leaf is stressed or not based on this information here. So a healthy plant will absorb by these dips that you see here. It tells you that it absorbs light there. Okay, so based on these interactions between light and vegetation. We then work with something that we call spectral vegetation indices. So where we create combinations of bands to maximize the sensitivity to certain um, characteristics of the plant. So for example, this would be a soil, this example here is a soil spectral signature. This is vegetation, the upper one. Vegetation has compared to many other objects, vegetation has a much higher reflectance in the near infrared. So this difference can be used to differentiate vegetation from other classes. And it can also be used to differentiate different characteristics of the plant, right? So if you look at this graph again, like if you look at the reflectance here, it tells us this difference tells us something about the condition of the leaf, and these differences in the red tell us something about the chlorophyll content. So how vigorous is the plant? And if you combine these reflectances, you get indices. You can multiply the values or divide them to create indices that kind of maximize the information that we receive about the plant's health status. So that is kind of in a nutshell the basis of how remote sensing works for vegetation monitoring. And depending on what you study, so if you study water or if you study urban areas, you will always go back to the spectral signature of that specific target to then be able to do the right interpretation of your status of your target based on a spectral signature. So then I have here example of what we do with remote sensing of phenology. So basically what we do is we take the satellite images, we calculate an index. It could be um, one index that is commonly used. Maybe you have heard about it. It's called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, the NDVI. Um, but there are many other indices. So it's just you take the bands and you create certain ratios to get an index that you can then use to represent the health status of the plant. So you would take your vegetation index and then um, you could take it at a daily basis over the same period, over the same study area, and then map its progress over time. So this here is an example of, let's say, an annual graph of vegetation index. So what you have here on the x-axis is day of year. So 100 would mean day 100 of the year, which is somewhere around March, April. And then on the y-axis you have the so I have it can be a vegetation index. It can be any other measure that you capture related from the plant on a daily or maybe weekly basis. And this is the progress of the plant. And you may want to think about this as the greening process, right? So if you have the winter period here, there is no growth happening. So then the plant starts to green up and they grow and grow and grow. They reach a peak where they don't actually grow anymore, but they start to reproduce and produce flowers and fruits. And then in the northern hemisphere, typical for northern hemisphere, and then they slowly die again until the winter, where they kind of stay without leaves. So this is the indices show us indicate the greenness of the vegetation. And so we can use this curve then to connect it to actual phenological phases. So what we do is, if you think about leaf unfolding this here, or the planting date of crops, you could connect it to a specific point on your graph. Then you can think about blooming, and you can use different models that will connect it also to a different point on your curve here. The peak of the season, flowering, flowering will happen somewhere here. Then you have leaf fall that happens maybe here, and then the end of the season where you have no more leaves. So you can connect the information, the phenology information that we usually that has been commonly observed by people. You can now actually connect it to a curve. So um, the phenology networks that exist, their kind of measurements are really the date of the, let's say, leaf budding, when the leaf starts to come out, flowering, fruits, when fruit starts to come, and then you have leaf fall maybe, and when all the leaves are, or most of the leaves are gone. That is, those are the measurements that the traditional phenology networks um, record. With remote sensing, we don't record that, but we record like a time series that represents greening. And then the whole thing with remote sensing of plant phenology is we try to connect these phases here to the curve, which is a challenge. Like it involves different methods, and up till today, in this part, this the research on this area, there is no consensus yet as how to globally extract these phenology indicators from satellite images. The research is still very, very intense here. So if I just so then this is an example. If you, for example, would extract the start of the growing season in a satellite image, then this would be an example of a map showing the start of the growing season. So this is an example of the Netherlands. And it shows between 2001 and 2004, it shows the start of the growing season for different land cover classes, grassland, winter wheat, and forest. So what you can notice here is the colors indicate the date that the vegetation started to green up. So the bluish colors are very early dates. So it means, for example, if you look at blue, it means day of year 65. That means plants started to become green around March, beginning of March. The greener color indicates dates between April, March, April, and darker green would be around July. So it gives you a range of the start when the plant starts actually to grow over time. So for example, here you can see that here the growing season was around 225, so around July. And then over the years, it actually became earlier. So July, and maybe here you have it around June. So that goes, it advances a few days to weeks for certain land cover types. And then what that means is that if you think about the relationship between carbon and the growing season period, right? The time that the plant can do photosynthesis, which is the process of absorbing the CO2 from our atmosphere and releasing and producing biomass, that will affect that basically. It will affect the CO2 balance. but it is also used for all kinds of other things. Like one thing that I'm also interested in is looking at like pollen, right? In grasslands, you can map flowering, for example, and you can create spatial maps of how is the flowering changing over time. So how do you monitor or how do you incorporate that into health programs? Like I have allergy, serious allergy problems, and that is something that I'm really interested in as well. So how can you use this technology then to extract this information and then incorporate it in some kind of allergy system? But Um, so that is a bit about the introduction to what I use in my research, and then we're now at um, one of the cases that I want to show. So peatlands and looking at phenology, carbon uptake, and then also temperature and precipitation. Why peatlands? So maybe a little bit of information about peatlands. Peatlands are part of the wetlands class. So these are ecosystems typically where you have a very high water table, so that the vegetation is a lot of the times soaked in water. Um, like it's maybe the most common example that I knew before I started to work with peatlands. I did not know what they were, but they're basically, so sometimes you have those movies where people run in a forest and then all of a sudden they sink into the into the watery mushy field and they kind of disappear. So that would be a peatland in a movie, but they are actually very interesting ecosystems because of the high water table they are able to actually accumulate a lot of organic material. So the material keeps accumulating. You have specialized types of vegetation that are able to live in those conditions. But a lot of the organic material keeps accumulating. And you may think about peat, for example, in horticulture, right? We use peat. If you go to the shop, you can buy peat for your plants. It is also used in a form of coal, like peat coal for heating. um, Peatland ecosystems have a huge biodiversity, so very important for life, animal life, plant life, very high biodiversity, and also very important for the carbon cycle because the material that is being accumulated here that is actually it's um, organic material, so it contains carbon. So the importance here is that when you think about peatlands, so the first graph here shows us a kind of the distribution of peatlands globally. So you see that is um, mainly concentrated in the northern hemisphere. Canada has a lot of the peatlands, but also here in Siberia you have northern Asia, and then some peatlands in South America. But if you look at the global land cover, peatlands cover less than 4% of our terrestrial land. But the global soil carbon, the amount that it stores there is about 20 to 30%. So it's really a large amount of carbon that's being stored in peatlands. And then when you think about what is happening today, the increasing surface temperature. So this image here shows you increased surface temperature relative to the normal between 1951 and 1980. So on average, it was 0.83 degrees Celsius warmer. But here you will see that it gets warmer in the northern hemisphere, basically where you have most of your peatlands. So then the question is, this here, this what is accumulating here, it happens because of the high water tables. But if it increases, the temperature increases, what will happen? The big question is what will happen with that water? Like, will it evaporate and now all the carbon will be released into the atmosphere? We don't know. Like, there's a lot of research going on that looks at that. So the question is what will happen with this natural organic reservoir in the peatlands if the climate keeps changing, if temperatures keep increasing? So if the temperature increases, and let's say we get earlier starts of the growing season because it gets warmer, um, does it mean that we will get longer growing seasons or not? And does it mean that the CO2 uptake the carbon uptake, will it increase or not? So that is a question that I actually asked in this research. And the study area was, there are four sites, three in Canada, distributed here. So one is here in Ottawa, Merbleu. Sandhill is Saskatchewan, and then La Biche in Alberta, and this site is in Finland. So these are all peatlands. And what they do have in common is that they have flux towers there. So flux towers are instruments that you put up on a tower, and they measure the carbon exchange between this vegetation and the atmosphere. So basically, you can measure the amount of CO2 that the plants absorb through photosynthesis, the amount of CO2 that is being released through respiration, and then actually the net amount that stays in the vegetation. That will be the biomass, like the net that stays in the plant. So all these sites had between 5 to 8 years of daily data of flux measurements, so carbon measurements. And then I also use time series analysis of satellite data. So some of the indices that I showed earlier is what I used in this portion. And based on that data then, what it shows here is that these are just graphs of the four sites. So remember there were four of those sites. This is information from the flux tower. So it measures carbon, which is also a remote sensing method because it measures the carbon without actually touching it. But it's not an image that you get just the measurements of your carbon exchange. So this here shows you for the four different sites, the raw data, and then it's smoothed here. So you just have the smoothed curves. And it shows you kind of how different the four different sites are. So some of them start early, like if I some of them the growing season starts here, like before around March maybe, and in these two here it starts later, like a month later. And these two sites, the growing season is actually also very short. So this includes the Finnish site, which is higher up. So very short growing season, whereas these two have longer growing seasons. And this indicates the amount of CO2 that is being absorbed. So the gross primary production, so the photosynthesis, the CO2 that is being um, uh, sequestered by the ecosystem is basically what this curve kind of indicates. It's an indication of how much of CO2 has been sequestered by the ecosystem by each one of those sites. So you see that all of them have very different patterns here. And okay, I didn't clean that off a second. And then then I looked at just the characteristics between the different sites. So in the left figure, what you see is here you have the sites. So Merbleu, La Biche, Sandhill, and Kamaran. Those are the four sites. And then here in the graph, you have the start of the season, the end of the season. I only want to focus on the start of the season. Sorry. So if you look at, this would be the start of the season. So those circles here. So these two sites, Merbleu and La Biche, they actually start like almost like a few weeks to a month earlier than the other two sites. So Kamanen is the site in Finland. It's very north. It's the most northern site. So this one has actually the shortest growing season. So you have here, these two sites actually start much earlier. And then if you look at the carbon information, the GPP represents photosynthesis, so the amount of carbon that is being absorbed by the vegetation through the process of photosynthesis. That would be these boxes here, right? These ones, the upper, right? These ones here. So you see, based these two sites that starts the photosynthesis very early on, like in March, they also accumulate most of the carbon through photosynthesis. These are the other two sites. It's much lower. But the thing is, what happens here is you see this is the respiration because plants they absorb CO2, but they also go through the process of respiration where they release CO2 also as well to the atmosphere. So you see that the respiration is actually pretty high, right? And both of them to the point that they almost get to the same level. So NEP here, that is the net carbon that the ecosystem keeps at it. So it's really not being released. It is the biomass basically. Um, this side here that has such a high photosynthesis, it cuts to the same level as these two sides here. Like the net uptake is actually at the same level as the other sides. So respiration plays an important role then, right? So even if if it's warmer and plants get to increase their photosynthesis, then the respiration will be important. And respiration will often depend, according to studies too, will depend on the temperature as well. But so what I did find in this study was that the sites with the earlier start of the growing season had higher photosynthesis rates, but the net carbon uptake was actually not always higher, not necessarily higher. And then for the other thing was to look at the relationship between the different phenology indicators. So if you think about, like the question was, um, increasing temperatures, will they result in an earlier start of the growing season? And would that result in longer growing seasons? And would that result into increased uptake of CO2? But the results actually did not confirm that. So what it did show was that the start or the length of the growing season did not really significantly relate to the carbon uptake. What was significantly related was the peak of the growing season. And that is the variable that we extract. If I just show you this here, this is this peak variable here. The peak is actually a very interesting indicator. It is used in different ways, and it's called different names in different science areas. It is a maturity state. So it's a level at which the plant actually reaches a maturity and it stops actually growing, um, uses all its resources then to reproduce for flowering, seeding, and then it goes back to dying. So the peak actually represents um, the health status is an integrated indicator of the health status of the plant because depending on the temperature, the precipitation, the nutrients that are available, the stress levels, plants will be able to reach a higher peak. So that the better the conditions are for the plant, the higher the peak will be. So it will reach its true potential, let's say its true growing potential. So that is actually what the results show that of all the indicators that um, yeah, were related to the carbon uptake. The peak was actually the one that had the highest correlation. So basically, this shows the relationship between the peak of the net ecosystem production and the peak of the photosynthesis, and it related to the total carbon uptake in a year. So the total amount of carbon that the ecosystem um, sequestered over a year. And in terms of the climate, what the study showed was that the winter, so warmer winter and wetter summers, kind of were associated with higher net carbon uptake. So not really the summer temperatures, but really the winter just before the summer. And then the summer available water was then important. Then after this portion that views basically the flux information, I then looked at satellite images. So I also extracted um, these time series for different indices from satellite images. And the purpose here was to look at whether these images could be used to indicate or to get information about the peak level of carbon uptake. Because the peak level of carbon uptake, so the annual peak rate was related to the total carbon uptake of the ecosystems. And the question here was if you use satellite images, because at the end that is the purpose, because if you want to study this over larger areas, you need a different method than the flux towers. The flux towers are very expensive. They are very sparse, really purely for research purposes. So if you want to be able to really look across a larger area consistently year to year, then remote sensing would be the way to actually go. But then you need to be able to use your satellite images to estimate the actual carbon information. And so this research actually showed an example here is from the Merbleu site in Ottawa. Over 8 years of carbon measurements, the red time series here shows the level of carbon that was being absorbed by photosynthesis. So it was pretty, there were two kind of levels. It was lower in the first 4 years and higher in the second half of this 8 year period. This was very related to the precipitation. These years were very dry years, dry compared to the normal. So Um, so the question here was then, can you use satellite data to estimate this variability? Because the peak is important to get information about the global carbon uptake, the annual carbon uptake. But the indices that I use were not able to actually mimic this year. They were not able. The peak values were the same. Like you see, there's no difference really. um, whereas there was a difference and a significant difference here. But so that just means that more study is needed actually. So so this is still ongoing, and I actually okay I'm at almost 40 minutes now, so I think I'm gonna close it. The second example is about Tundra. This comes from a student that I have right now. He's doing his honors thesis on this. So he's looking at the tundra a bit the same, looking at phenology, carbon uptake. He chooses study site in Quebec. So he basically he's looking at three different areas and with different compositions of vegetation. And then his questions were really about looking at phenology shifts, changes in the land cover as well between 2000 and 2018, and also to analyze the relationships between climate, phenology, and land cover. So he found a significant increase in the peak variable. So not in the start of the season, not in the end of the season, but really in the peak. Also some change in the land cover, but not a lot really. And then when he looked at the relationships, he found that the frost days were very important. So how many days there were with snow cover or ice on the ground. So this is actually still ongoing. He's still working on this, but it's kind of ongoing research. So in summary, in conclusion, I think peatlands play a very important role, and studying peatlands and actually all kinds of vegetation. Vegetation plays an important role in our lives. It is our food. It's our CO2 sequester. It has very many roles for us. So it's very important to study vegetation. Peatlands, very important because of the huge carbon sink that they have. Um, and then maybe to close this, I'm rapidly to talk about geospatial technologies and remote sensing. I have to say that this area of It's you can consider it science and technology. It's a combination. It is an area that has really kind of saved me. Should I say it like that? I know that when I was younger, I knew a lot of people that I had a lot of friends that knew from the beginning that they wanted to be, I don't know, a nurse or a doctor, or they knew from when they were 5 years old what they wanted to be. And I never knew what I wanted to do. I just wanted to do everything. I had an interest in almost everything, and that was very worrisome. But then geospatial technologies, remote sensing, GIS, this here, it allows you to study anything that you're interested in, right? It's global. You can take a satellite image and study urban growth. You can study vegetation. You can study water. You can take GIS, so geoinformation systems, so spatial data, and you can study social demographic information globally, locally, regionally. Um, it's a very, very interesting area. If you are not sure about what you want to do, this is really um, a nice science and technology, I would say, research area to look at. And I have to thank actually all the sponsors, funding that I have received for my research, NSERC, F4KNT, Agriculture Canada, who I work with a lot today, actually, Concordia, MyTex. These are students, when we do field work, we do a lot of field work to collect ground validation. So ground validation is a very important portion of our life. It's going really into the field and measuring plant information. This is protection for pollen. That's why we work with this super mask. There was no COVID back then. It was really pollen. Pollen can be mean in the field. So, um, okay, I think that was it. I hope I didn't go over time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Angela Kross. We do already have a question from the audience. Gabriella may like to pose that question.
Lizzie is asking if there are similar methods that are used to estimate the NPP in other environments. So she's saying that is if we need like a CO detector tower in each environment to be able to draw a relationship with the satellite image.
Okay, yeah. So the flux towers actually you have the flux towers in many different ecosystems. So you have a lot in forest ecosystems as well. This would be the method that is maybe more easier to relate to satellite images if you think about the time series um, characteristic. But people, there are other methods. So people also put what they call chambers in the field. Like they're like little, like the the large water bottles that they sell. People actually have adapted those large water bottles, the big ones, in the field, and they put in a sensor in that environment. It's just like it's called a chamber. Then you will have a sensor that measures the CO2 within that small like area. But it's because it's such a small area, the flux towers would be the best way to measure and compare it with satellite images because you have a larger area that you're measuring from. There are also ground measurements where people actually sample biomass. So they would basically cut plants. So I have done that with agriculture. Like you would go into the field and cut the plants, and then you have the biomass, which would represent the net ecosystem production. So you have different methods to do that, but those are all very, very intensive in terms of the going into the field and collecting that, bringing it into the lab, measuring it, sample. It's a lot of it's very intensive. Um, so those would be the different methods. And so for the relationships with satellite images, the best would be really flux towers. But we don't. There are currently many flux towers. Like if you look at this image, there are more. You have the American flux. You have internationally. You have networks, and they're kind of increasing. And currently, you also have what we call the Phenocam network, which is a network of cameras. So these cameras here that I showed here, these cameras as well, they take daily images, and you can actually extract time series from those cameras as well. And then that would be more vegetation indices. It's not really carbon information actually. So um, yeah, so I think, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think you did. Yeah.
I have just unmuted Lucienne just to see if she would like to ask the
Hi.
question.
Yes, yeah, it does answer my question. If I can, since I have the phone, if we could ask another question, which I asked in the Q&A. You have a very interesting career path. So you've studied in different areas and in different countries. So you have any tips for students who might still be unsure about which career path to choose?
What I would say is I think you first have to know what you like. That was something that has I have changed so many times. And you at one point you have, if you are not sure yet what you like, you have to find that, oh, there are different ways, right? You look at what makes you happy, and you start to make notice that, so that you know what in what area you will focus. So once you know, I think from my experience, once you know what you like, then you have to actively work on a strategy. Like it's not I think in today's world, it's a very competitive world today. You have to set up a strategy, and a strategy would often be part of that would be working on a network, um, finding out what you want to study, and then looking for opportunities for, it can be volunteering, it can be internships, any kind of projects that you can do within your area of interest to build that network, um, will be important. And then depending on how what direction you want to go, I guess if you want to go towards professional versus academic, then it would a bit change there. But I think you have to craft a strategy that starts with finding out what you like and creating a network and experience in that area. Well, that is from my experience. Um, I think I have, when I came into Canada, I did my PhD here. But before I started my PhD, I actually tried to work with my masters. It was very, very hard. And I ended up doing a volunteering at the Canadian Center of Remote Sensing. 3 months just free volunteering, but it was the best thing ever. It created a network for me. I was able to have a network. um, I published my first paper at that point together with a group. I got funding for my PhD from them afterwards. So it was an investment. I did have to go and move to Ottawa and volunteer, and bike 40 minutes from Gatineau to Ottawa, but it was so worth it. So I think once you have the strategy in your mind, you have to go after it and then set it out. It is possible. You have to just plan it out. Nothing can be left to wait for things to happen. You have to do your part in it. And I think networking is important. Like if you grow up here and you went to school here, it may be a bit more easier to work on that. But if you come from abroad and you have to start it from zero, for me it was volunteering that put me in.
Thank you. That's phenomenal advice. I think what you say is you can't wait for things to happen is incredible advice. I was I was blown away about the CO2 accumulating in the winter. Just blown away by that. And then you showed us that sort of this amazing thing I hadn't thought about is that actually like this warming where plants are going to start their growing season earlier. I always found that shocking when I'd heard that information before. However, it seems like, hey, it's good because it's bringing the CO2 levels down. And this idea of warm winters allows the peak. I was surprised, though, that the respiration was so high. Is that because the winters are so warm? Or, I mean, a lot of things happened in 2020 with the fires in California, with Russia being on fire in the Arctic areas. Is it seems like it's good that the plants can start growing earlier. However, is this exposing the peatlands in some way to release more carbon than they would have normally?
Yeah, I think so. The ecosystem respiration, that is actually I know there are a lot of studies going on this to actually find out what is happening, because um, it could mean that it has been related to the temperature. So it could mean that if it's starting earlier, the plants are also more active, and just um, the respiration is just going up equally with the photosynthesis. Um, I think with yeah, for this portion here, I haven't focused on the ecosystem respiration anymore. I usually look at the gross photosynthesis, because that is a measure that you actually can directly, almost directly derive from satellite images. So for the ecosystem respiration, you do have to go to Flux data. But yeah, so this is still ongoing, and I'm actually not sure what is happening. One of the major concerns also is that as the peatlands dry, because they have a lot of water, that then the methane levels will the release of methane will also go up. So that is also something that is being studied by a lot of researchers. So the CO2 uptake could go up, but then also by drying up the water, um, that would release methane to the atmosphere, and that would actually also add to the greenhouse gas balance. So that's it's the balance of the CO2, the carbon balance is actually probably more complex than just only the what I'm showing here. And I know that there is a lot of research going on the methane actually, in terms of peatlands, because people are afraid what will happen with that.
Thank you.
Hello, doctor. I just have a quick question. It's something that me and Ms. Stephanie we discussed once in our lab, and when I looked into the video again about the CO2, seeing how increasingly it is in the winter, I just wanted to ask how big is of an influence it affects humans, in this case being CO2 all around, especially here in Canada, and in the future, would this effect be so huge in a way that humans in future could actually evolve in a way to adapt with the CO2 around us? I just wanted, because we tried to discuss it last time, and Ms. Stephanie, I would like to see your opinion on it too, please.
I think in terms of the first, I think, effect that comes with that huge accumulation is would be maybe related to the global the greenhouse gas balance that is increasing, and so the greenhouse gas effect is actually getting worse, whereas we are getting warm, it's getting warmer and warmer. So the direct effect would be more related to having this increased heating on Earth, and that would affect um, the global climate pattern as well. So it's more environmental. On humans, I don't know. Yeah, I think we probably have to see what will happen with us if it continues, how we will um, evolve to get used to CO2. Yeah, it will probably be, if this continues, then either the heating with the extreme weather events combined with natural disasters, um, together with maybe low oxygen, will maybe at one point affect populations numbers. But yeah, I'm actually not sure, yeah, if how we will evolve. if we will, we probably will, we will. I guess over time people have changed. I know um, there are groups of people that actually are testing the hypothesis of humans being able to do photosynthesis, but by looking at the light. So I haven't seen anything that came out of that yet. But there are people that are trying to do that just by maybe that will happen. Maybe one day we'll be able to do some photosynthesis and be able to mimic what plants are doing. But yes, that is just I'm not sure. Yes,
Thank you, doctor.
but it's interesting to think about what will happen.
I would like to share some of the love that's coming your way, Dr. Kross. So I'll read out a few of these, the messages that are coming in to the chat. So we have, thank you, Dr. Angela Kross, for this amazing presentation. The plant phenology video was incredibly interesting since you saw the rise of the CO2 level when the vegetation started to disappear and how the CO2 level almost completely vanished as soon as the vegetation starts to grow back. Thank you for the amazing presentation, for sharing your knowledge. From Rugi, she says, it was really interesting to learn how the vegetation has changed over the years with climate change. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. William says, thank you for teaching us about forests and our plants. I feel grateful to have learned more about phenology today. From Ganesha, thank you for your time and coming to present your work. From Sammy, thank you for your great presentation. It really puts in perspective many actual changes for humankind, such as agriculture and global warming. It really makes us think. From Kasal, thank you for sharing your knowledge. It was very interesting that we were able to study vegetation without touching them through science and technology. I will continue to think about the importance of satellite imaging in knowledge of plants' health status. Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Kross. You have opened my eyes. I have not thought about these things before. From Radha, thank you for the interesting information. It's important for us to know what is happening in the world around us so we can help save the earth for the next generation. Elise, thanks you for your experience and sharing your knowledge with us. Gabriella says, thank you for taking the time. You really opened my eyes about how important it is to analyze our vegetation. Also, your field study has so many options that it makes it very interesting. I like how technology connects with our vegetation and how research connects with such important topics like climate change. Thank you again. And Abood, thank you, Dr. Kross, for this very informative presentation. We all benefited from your breadth of knowledge and depth of expertise. Emily, thanks you. The talk about plant life with so much data. She didn't realize there were so many ways to study plant life in the environment. So you've really opened our eyes here. From Rachel, Russell, sorry. Thanks for your time, doctor. The information you gave us not only taught us something about how to realize many things, such as the current situation of our planet. Yeah, there's two more. Mustafa says, thank you, Dr. Kross, for this amazing talk. It made me consider making a strategy, as you said, and I can find what to do and what to like, and also taking advantage of networking and volunteering. And Elias finally says, thank you for explaining how to observe different satellite images as a method of studying and obtaining information on objects without even going there to touch them. And Brian says, thank you for the entertaining presentation. We really learned a lot about the importance of plants. So thank you very much. And if everyone wouldn't mind showing their videos to thank Dr. Kross for coming to us today and sharing everything that she has taught us. I'm going to put us on gallery view and see. I don't think we see everyone's.
No. But I have to thank you very much for those notes. I mean, it's great to have that feedback. It's it's funny because the video about phenology is one of my favorite ones, but I have never received such nice feedback on it. So I'm really happy that it was a useful talk for you. It was really great to participate. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think I have to. Okay. Okay. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
so
you,
much,
doctor.
doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.